what? Yeah. This one, and then good evening and welcome to the Jay's 72nd Annual Detroit Jewish Book Fair. Can't believe it's 72 years. My name is Sandy Matz and I'm a member of the Book Fair Executive Committee. Book Fair is proudly sponsored by the Jay, where you can find your Jewish center. Book Fair would like to thank Bronze Book Fair sponsors ADL Michigan Anti-Defamation League and the Sis Maisel Center for Judaic Studies and Community Engagement, Oakland University, as well as sponsors J-Learn and SAGE, Seminars for Adult Jewish Enrichment, for their support. Thanks to all of our generous donors, we are able to present most of our programs free of charge, and we invite you to become a patron or sponsor as well. I also want to extend our gratitude to the entire Book Fair Committee. Your dedication and efforts have made all of this possible. We have a dynamic lineup of fantastic authors and programs that you will not want to miss. Please pick up a Book Fair brochure or visit our website at jccdet.org/bookfair for more information. Please also visit our bookstore after this program. Your purchases help to support this annual event and allow us to bring these wonderful authors to our community. Additionally, please shop online bookstore where you will find more hand-selected books. Just visit bookshop.org/shop/Jewish Book Fair. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's special guests. Rabbi Diana Fersko is the senior rabbi at the Village Temple in Manhattan. She served as national vice president of the Women's Rabbinic Network and is a member of the New York Board of Rabbis. She received her rabbinic ordination from Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, where she also earned a master's degree in Hebrew literature. For more than a decade, Rabbi Fersko has been preaching and teaching about anti-Semitism. Emily Broder is the Associate Regional Director for ADL Michigan. Emily oversees ADL Michigan's Young Leadership Initiatives, Incident Response, Advocacy, as well as other community partnerships and events. Emily holds a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from the University of Michigan and a Master of Education Elementary Curriculum and Instruction from Loyola University, Chicago. Following the program, Rabbi Fersko will be signing copies of We Need to Talk About Anti-Semitism just outside the gallery. At this time, please silence your cell phones and turn off any devices that light up or go bump in the night. We have handed out 3x5 cards for you to write down questions, and we will collect them after the talk. You don't have to wave them around. We'll come around and collect them, and we'll get to as many questions as possible. And right now, we will start our talk with Rabbi Fersko and Emily Broder.
Thank you, Sandy, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. It's really an honor for me to share this stage with you, Rabbi Fersko. I'm just thrilled to see so many people here tonight. The devastating war and ensuing attacks on Jewish communities across the globe have made this conversation more urgent than it was when we both originally signed on to participate several months ago. So before I jump into conversation with Rabbi Fersko, please allow me to take a moment to tell you why it's so important for me personally to be here tonight. I started working for ADL just over a year and a half ago. A large portion of my job is dedicated to incident response. Every Michigan incident that is reported to ADL crosses my desk. Each incident is unique, and each one warrants a unique response. We work with schools, law enforcement, community organizations, businesses, and individuals. And regardless of the action taken, we record each incident for our annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents. Last year, we recorded the highest number of anti-Semitic incidents nationally since we began tracking the data over 45 years ago. Since Israel was attacked on October 7th, incidents have spiked dramatically. At last count, 3 weeks into the war, we saw a 388% increase over the same 3-week period a year ago. I checked this afternoon, and as of about 4 or 5 p.m., we had 71 reports of incidents in Michigan since the war began, October 7th. In these troubling times, it's so important for us to come together to discuss anti-Semitism and work together to fight it. With that in mind, I'm so pleased to be here with all of you, and particularly with you, Rabbi Fersko. As the senior rabbi at the Village Temple in Manhattan, Rabbi Fersko leads a congregation that opens its doors to all who wish to join. She started the largest and longest running millennial engagement program in New York City, Shabbat After Dark, attracting hundreds of young Jewish people each month. In addition to connecting with people in her own congregation and city, Rabbi Fersko has engaged the greater Jewish community through conversations about anti-Semitism. She asserts that avoiding these difficult conversations is perilous for Jews. As we've seen in the past several weeks, the need to address anti-Semitism head-on is more important now than ever. So let's jump into this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. And, Emily, I feel the same. We connected on Zoom, but I knew we would be great conversation partners. And I also just want to thank the Jewish community here. I can already tell you, you guys have been lovely and amazing. And it's really an honor to get to be with you and with Jewish communities across the country at this time of great intensity.
So, Rabbi Fersko, you conceived of this book and wrote this book long before the attack on Israel. Will you tell us a little bit about why you wanted to write this book?
Sure. So, as Emily mentioned, I'm a congregational rabbi, and rabbis have the great privilege of speaking from the bima about topics that we think are morally urgent. And I spoke about many topics. One of them was anti-Semitism. And when I spoke about anti-Semitism, it's hard to imagine this, but go back in your minds, even 5 years, 10 years ago, anti-Semitism was not in the headlines. And it was not a commonly thought about issue amongst most of my people. And when I say my people, I mean like non-Orthodox Jews, liberals, religiously liberal. And when I spoke about it, I would get pushback. Does anyone want to guess what the pushback was? I would talk about anti-Semitism, and people would say, don't talk about that. What do you think? Keep your head down. Okay, right. Sometimes talking about anti-Semitism only feels like you're going to exacerbate more anti-Semitism. So maybe just don't mention that. Any other guesses? Yeah, I see a hand in the back. Go ahead. You got it. Okay. So I was told, not by everyone, but by a few people, anti-Semitism is over, basically. And I understood it. I don't even judge it as a piece of feedback because I was raised in some sense in that way, and many in my generation were. Anti-Semitism was something that we looked at and we learned about, right? We read about it in books. We watched movies about it. We went to museums and looked at anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism didn't really look at us in our generation. A little here and there, but it wasn't this urgent topic on the forefront of our minds. But even though I got that sort of negative feedback, I kept talking about it. And the more I spoke about it, people started coming forward to me with their own encounters about anti-Semitism. And that's where I became very troubled and concerned. So a congregant told me, on the playground, my 9-year-old had pennies thrown at his feet. It broke my heart. Another mom would call and say, should I mention that my child did a tech internship in Israel this summer on their college applications? Or maybe Israel isn't really the thing to mention now when you're applying to college. And that sort of thing really unnerved me and made me feel frustrated. And I wasn't seeing like our stories reflected in the national discourse at that time. It just wasn't out there. It was like none of this was happening. Then in 2020, in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement, my synagogue was attacked with a baseball bat. And it broke the glass door of my house of worship. I mentioned that it was during Black Lives Matter because it was a big night of destruction in New York City. Like, we weren't the only ones attacked. But for me, seeing my house of worship desecrated in that way broke my heart and made me feel outraged and just even more certain that now was the time I was going to bring this message beyond my congregation. And I decided to do it with a book, and that's how I ended up here in Detroit with you.
Well, I'm sorry that happened, but I will just tell everyone here, the book is so phenomenal. It is very easy to access. It's organized really based on the incidents and the questions that people brought to you. And so I want to jump into the question that I think is on most people's minds right now, and that is anti-Semitism as it relates to Israel. So you do have a chapter devoted to this, and recent events obviously make this chapter essential reading. Can you share how you see the issues of anti-Semitism in Israel playing out now in our country?
I mean, we could talk about that forever.
The whole night.
And, so I'll say this. First of all, you should know who I am. I'm an outspoken Zionist. I'm a lover of Israel. I've lived in Israel. I lived there in 2006, for example, during the Second Lebanon War, and that's something I want to talk about in a minute. I traveled to Israel with my family. My friends are Israelis. And the first thing I want to mention is how devastated I think we all are. This is a moment where the Jewish community globally is in pain, and we're horrified. And it's a moment of grieving. I felt like I sat Shiva for the first week at least, and I'm still in a little bit of a state of shock. What I tried to do in the book is describe exactly as you say, give these firsthand encounters with anti-Semitism, and from them draw ways that we can think about anti-Semitism in a more systematic way. So in the Israel chapter, one of the ideas that I talk about, which I believe, is that the way we talk about Israel is the way we talk about the Jewish people. So if, for example, the way the national discourse goes about Israel is to describe it as hyper-violent, needlessly violent, bloodthirsty, aggressive, then that's how we're painting the Jews, as hyper-violent, needlessly aggressive, bloodthirsty. For me, there's a clear Venn diagram in an overlap between that description of the Jewish collective and the description of the Jewish collective that we used in the Middle Ages, which we refer to as the blood libel. I'm very sensitive to how we talk about Israel because it's how we talk about the people we represent, and you and your children and your grandchildren. And I say that strongly, and I also say this strongly. That's true no matter what you think about Israel. So if you are 100% supportive, that still is true. If you're very angry with Israel and you were really unhappy before about their government, or you don't like how they're responding to this, still applies. The way we talk about Israel is the way we talk about the Jewish people. In terms of the war itself, for me, I'm very concerned and focused on what will happen in the north. As I mentioned, I lived in Israel during the Second Lebanon War, which at that time was the longest war in Israel's history. And it was a war against Hezbollah, which is a terrorist organization in the south of Lebanon. And if they get involved, I will be deeply, deeply concerned. Their infrastructure is massive compared to Hamas. Their military capabilities are far, far greater than Hamas in terms of volume, precision, monetary skill level, and fighting a war on all of these fronts at once makes me extremely nervous. The second thing I want to say about what's happening right now in Israel is that we've seen a great amount of anti-Semitism here at home, and I see a lot of heads nodding, in the aftermath of October 7th. It's horribly disheartening to see that after the greatest massacre since the Shoah, that there are people calling for additional violence towards us. As you mentioned, my congregation is downtown. We're a few blocks from NYU, from Washington Square Park, where many of these protests are happening, which means that many of the protesters are frequently hanging around our neighborhood. And in our neighborhood, we had somebody carrying a sign with a Magen David, like I'm wearing, but in a trash can, really horrible anti-Semitic image. We've, of course, had these horrible chants. We have a lot of kids at Cornell, parents of Cornell kids. And I think that there's been this global realization that anti-Semitism is back. And now when I talk about it, no one's going to tell me, it doesn't exist anymore. Everyone knows now.
Yeah. So you mentioned Cornell, and that really leads into my next question. We know that college students are really struggling with anti-Semitism right now tied to Israel. Can you talk about the BDS movement, boycott, divest, and sanction, and its role in amplifying anti-Semitism on college campuses?
So maybe 5 to 7 years ago, parents asking me about BDS was the number one question I got. Like, should I send my kid to this college? Do they have BDS there? Do they have BDS there? Do they have BDS there? It was almost like a refrain. And now what's troubling is that actually BDS as an institution, as a movement, has shrunk quite a bit. However, the ideas of BDS have expanded. Okay? So while people don't say, do they have BDS? Actually, it's worse because you have professors saying horrible things, sort of legitimizing violence against Jews. You have professors doing what we call double standarding, which is isolating Israel and painting it as, an evil actor, as an immoral state, and not just an immoral state, but the most immoral state, right? They're not talking about, well, look at Syria and what's happened there and what Assad did to his own people, which was so much greater in volume and terror and cruelty than anything we're talking about on any side of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. For example, no mention of that, but this real focus on Israel as being uniquely criminal. And that's anti-Semitism. So on the college campuses, what needs to happen and what didn't happen is that the massacre should have been condemned instantly as a terrorist attack. And we need our administrators to do that. I personally don't need them to do much, much more than that. I need them to send a clear message to condemn a terrorist attack against Jews. That shouldn't be difficult. But what's scary is that it is. It's very difficult. And we need to think about the pressure points that they're under that have allowed them to get into this space, whether those pressure points are financial, whether they're moral, philosophical, academic. We as a Jewish community, and I know the ADL is leading the way on this in many levels, need to be thinking about how do we create an environment where it is obvious that they need to instantly condemn terrorism against Jews. And I'm very, very worried that we've already spent years laying an environment, and I talk about this in the book. As you mentioned, I wrote this book. A book starts 3 years ago, and it was in my mind long before that. We've laid this environment where the opposite is true, where you can allow all of these anti-Semitic phrases, and more than just the phrases, also the energy. The energy of anti-Semitism is plaguing these campuses. One of the ways I talk about anti-Semitism is as a virus. It can lay dormant, but it's still there. So one thing I tell college students as a practical matter is the second you get to college, find a Jewish community. March yourself into Hillel, find Jewish friends in your dorm. Some people like Chabad, and you need a community because something will happen. Something will come up. And when it does, you need to process it with friends, you need to strategize, and the last thing we want is for our Jewish kids on these campuses to feel isolated and alone.
I totally agree with that, and we've had so many calls come into our office from parents, grandparents, and even students who are concerned about their safety on college campuses. So I would like to echo exactly what you said about finding Jewish organizations and finding community where you feel safe. We do have a number of initiatives where we're allowing people on our website just to quickly sign on to a letter to campus administration. And here in Michigan, we have letters to U of M, MSU, and Wayne State urging administration to take a stronger stand against the anti-Semitism that has really is really pervasive in the environment on all these campuses.
Right. And what's a pain point for them is my previous point, which is the way you talk about Israel is the way you talk about the Jews. And that is a message that many of them are very resistant to hearing, because what they want, not they all, but some of people would like to do, is to condemn Israel. That seems to be, the real moral urgency for some of these leaders. And that will only result in more anti-Semitism for us. And yet, it will have very little impact on actual Israel. So I have to wonder, what is this about?
Right. You made a strong point in the book about speaking to young people about anti-Semitism and really giving them the tools to combat it, which is also something that's very important in our work at ADL. So this points us to really a generational difference. Anti-Semitism can seem different depending on the age of the person experiencing it. In your book, you talk a bit about microaggressions, and that's a term that's relatively new and more commonly used by members of a younger generation. So can you share with this audience some of the generational differences that you see with anti-Semitism?
Sure. So the way you think about anti-Semitism is largely related to your age. As I said, I'm what they call an elder millennial, which basically means I'm 41. And in my childhood, as I mentioned, there was some anti-Semitism, but it was more on the level you're mentioning, microaggressions. It wasn't this grotesque, pervasive expression. However, I've been traveling the country talking to communities like yours, and I can say with certainty that that is not the experience of teens today. Teens today, I do an exercise with them. It's a barometer exercise. Everyone stands up. The right side of the room, this side of the room is agree. This side of the room is disagree. And I ask them questions, and they can stand anywhere they want along the spectrum, along the barometer. And the question I say to them is I have experienced anti-Semitism directly. Guess what? Every single teen I talk to walks all the way to the agree sign, meaning they have all directly experienced anti-Semitism. That is not true in my generation. They have it online, right? They have TikTok. I just saw a stat today that came out about, how many, how much higher Stand With Palestine is trending, for example, than Stand With Israel. They have TikTok, they have Snap, they have Insta. So they're on these platforms constantly. They're always seeing anti-Semitic images or ideas or things that aren't fully anti-Semitic but are hostile towards Jews. I've had kids tell me since October 7th that they've had horrible things said directly to them by their peers, and I'm not going to repeat them because they're just grotesque and vulgar. And I've also had kids say, well, actually, what my peers do is they just say things near me. They don't say things in front of me. They just say it within earshot. They know I can hear. That is heartbreaking. What we're asking these teens to deal with is totally unacceptable, and soon they'll be on college campuses. And I described what happens with me, and then when you get into older generations, often there is wisdom there. Often people that are in the 70 plus category do have lived experience with anti-Semitism. So the point of this is that we need to talk about anti-Semitism, and it needs to be an intergenerational conversation. So if you have grandchildren, ask them what they're dealing with. Tell them something you've encountered, because we have a lot to learn from each other. And if we only stay within the bands of sort of our peer group, then we're really missing the bigger picture of what's happening. So I urge everyone to check in on a loved one and ask how they're doing. And maybe you even have something to share also.
Excellent advice. And when we talk about microaggressions at ADL, we use the pyramid of hate, and you also referred to a pyramid in your book. And those microaggressions, just little insidious comments, are at the lower levels of the pyramid. But we know that when they go unchecked, you get into more aggressive and virulent anti-Semitism and hatred. And so we have a disruptor method where you want to disrupt any form of hate at the lowest levels. Disrupt it as soon as you see it.
Yes. So I completely agree with that. And I'll give an example. So I was working out with a partner. It was like a partner workout. We were at a gym. And she was telling me a story about somebody else. And she said, you know, that woman, she's pretty, but Jewish. And I just stood there like, what? You know, and I'm Jewish.
And a rabbi.
Right. Also, I'm a rabbi. But so it took my breath away. You know, obviously to her, pretty but Jewish, those things, she was juxtaposing them. They did not go together. And I want to say I didn't say anything. And a lot of times we don't, because it's very uncomfortable. It could be a coworker. It could be your boss. It could be your daughter-in-law. You know, like microaggressions are often from people that we're in social settings with. And I should have said something. And now I do. But it's like, I feel like we all have a story like that where we let something slip. And now is not the time to let it slip. Now is the time to say, girlfriend, I am pretty and Jewish. What are you saying? You know?
And that really, you know, beautifully illustrates the title of the book, We Need to Talk About Anti-Semitism. When we have these conversations, it does make it easier to disrupt microaggressions or any level of hatred when we experience it in the moment, so that we don't have to go back and say, I should have, or I regret that I didn't, or go back to that conversation later.
I also think there's a real spectrum when it comes to anti-Semitism. It's not like every single person is calling for the death of Jews. You know, this person is somebody I could have spoken to and said, like, I think you maybe have like a wrong idea about what it means to be a Jew. Or I could have said, that really makes me uncomfortable because I think what you're doing is sort of like putting down the way Jewish women look. You know, there's a lot of ways you can say something to somebody where they can hear it. Mm-hmm. I even like to repeat a statement back to the person that they just said to make them hear what it sounds like. So I just, because we started with Israel and that's really like a very strong feeling, I just want to say, like, there's also room for people to learn in this conversation.
Absolutely. And we always focus on the impact versus the intent. As you said, not everyone wants to see Israel destroyed, but they may not realize the way that statement impacts you. And that's really important to point out. Mm-hmm. So thank you for that advice. In one of your chapters in your book, you tackled Christianity. And in that chapter you say, and I'm going to give kind of a long quote here, Christian anti-Semitism of the past was about polarization, making it clear that Jews were as different from Christians as humanly possible. Thankfully, that kind of anti-Semitism is no longer officially sanctioned by mainstream Christian denominations. But Christian anti-Semitism has found a way to continue to survive, because today, Christian anti-Semitism does the opposite of what it used to do. Instead of insisting that Jews are wholly different from Christians, it insists that Jews are wholly the same as Christians. And that's the end of the quote. Can you unpack that a bit for us? Tell us why you feel that insistence on sameness is anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm.
So I want to first go back to the way it was. This is pre-Holocaust, sort of since the inception of the church. There were anti-Semitic policies enacted and emphasized and spread by the church. And many of these policies were about marking us as different. So at different points in time, we were forced to wear a hat or a ring, or of course, you know about the yellow star. That was not from the church. That's a different example. To mark us as different. We were quarantined in our homes on Christian holidays, lest we should come near a Catholic. We were forbidden to participate in certain professions. Everything, we were demonized in their church literature and in their liturgy and in their Bible. All of these efforts were to explain to their followers that Jews were different, right? We were other than. We were immoral, or we were supposed to be some kind of criminal or sexual deviant. We were devilish, and our very existence was a denial of their salvific claims. This has changed dramatically. And I specifically want to give some honor and recognition to the Catholic Church, because they've made great efforts to build a friendship and do some atonement with the Jewish people. I was fortunate to travel to Oxford, England, where I met with representatives of the Vatican at the beginning of the summer, and this is an ongoing effort. And I should also say they're actually pretty, their official doctrine on Israel is we don't comment, which is we'll take it, it's good compared to many other groups. So now Christian anti-Semitism looks different, and it looks like identity denial. And that's what I talk about in the book. So I'll give you some examples. You're so lucky Hanukkah comes so early this year so that you have time to celebrate Christmas. Well, I don't celebrate Christmas. Well, you must have a tree. No, I really don't. Disbelief that you really could be another way, a different way. Having to explain that while we do have a great deal in common, a mikvah is not the same as a baptism. Taking the communion is not, or taking the wafer is not the same as a challah. These are representative of very different, opposing religious ideas. So what I would like from the larger Christian community is just some recognition that actually Jews are not sort of just on their way to being Christians. We're not a version of Christianity. We don't need to quote, know Jesus. And respect for being different and particular and who we are. And I think that's varied depending on where you live in the country and who you interact with. I do want to say, in regards to this question, though, one of the greatest ways to fight anti-Semitism right now is by reaching out to your Christian friends or family. We need allyship. And it's a time of unlikely allyship and changing allyship. I gave the Catholic Church as an example. They've been a pretty good ally to the Jewish people right now. But I think on a personal level, Jews are going to have a very hard time fighting this fight alone. And so we need our Christian friends or other religions, non-religions, to be there for us and to say what they think out loud and in public. And when they do that, I am deeply grateful.
I absolutely agree with that. I know I've been very moved in the past several weeks just by personal outreach, hearing from friends, but I do think hearing from entire communities is so important. So thank you for sharing that. Just changing lanes here a little bit to a chapter about the Holocaust, in which you coined a new term that you call flat Holocaust. So you describe flat Holocaust as the culturally aggressive miniaturization of the genocide against Jewish people. Now, can you explain a little bit about flat Holocaust? What does this look like? Why do you feel that it is so dangerous?
So flat Holocaust is a cultural practice that we've adopted in the United States that I detest. And it is relentless analogizing of the Holocaust. It's using the Holocaust to describe your pain, which has nothing to do with the actual Holocaust. Example, on a podcast the other day, I heard somebody say, working at Amazon was like a death march. No, a death march is like a death march. And when I talk about flat Holocaust, this is sort of what I mean. Which sentence better explains the truth and history? Millions of people died in the Holocaust. 6 million people died in the Holocaust. 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust by Nazis in concentration camps and over open graves. Do you see what I mean? There's a vagueness happening in the world about Jewish history in particular, and it's a huge problem. And it goes back to your initial question. Now we see words like genocide lobbed at us, except that word was invented to describe what happened to us particularly. So we need to talk about Jewish history, the Holocaust, and other things with great specificity. We need to know Jewish history in order to do that. Because what flat Holocaust does is divorce the tragedy from the victims. It diminishes what actually happened to us. And the worst thing it does is it allows Holocaust denial to seep in. And right now, we're seeing quite the explosion of denial in our country and around the globe, right? So when we saw these horrible atrocities committed, the Israeli government knew immediately that they had to show the videos and the graphic images from that massacre so that people wouldn't say it didn't happen.
And they're still saying it didn't happen.
Exactly. But guess what? They still said it. So, we were talking about microaggressions and how you have to kind of get in there. And the same thing is true when I hear flat Holocaust happening, and I hear it all the time from people that just don't know better. Vegans call eating meat like a Holocaust on a plate. Like, I've heard a religious institution call abortion the Holocaust of the unborn. Like, no. There is a historical event that happened to us that's real. And we need to be the ones to tell that story. We can't, you can't constantly borrow from the Jewish tragedy and use it as a synonym for the word bad. That's not what it was. And when we allow that to happen, not that it's in our control, but when we allow it to happen, we get outcomes that are completely ignorant about who we are.
Speaking of the importance of language, we're also hearing terms like genocide and colonialism being thrown around and accusations put out there about Israel committing these atrocities. So can you share your perspective on the use of that language, apartheid, colonialism, and how we can respond to it?
Okay, so there are a few options. One, you can give a factual defense. You can say, like, these are the definitions of these terms. Here's why they're not true. I'm going to be honest and say I use that approach less and less. Sad. I use education in my congregation and amongst Jews. So I educate about our history and what we've been through and who we are and the situation in Israel, etc. But when somebody uses those terms, it's usually an indication to me that they're actually not interested in facts, and that they've gone to a different place. So rather than get in arguments, I don't know, a Twitter feud or something like that, I'm more interested in using leverage, not reason, with someone like that. So leverage is about what we were talking about earlier with the college campuses, for example, what the ADL is doing, what parents are doing around the country, writing letters to these administrators and letting them know, like, it can be as simple as, here's how this language makes me feel. You don't have to be an expert in policy and history and Judaism. You can just say, like, this makes me feel not included. This hurts my feelings. This doesn't feel based on history. This doesn't make me feel safe. You can let them know that. I've seen a lot of business leaders come out and try and use leverage. So with terms like that are just ahistorical or non-factual or whatever it is, I say use leverage more than reason. I don't really like that answer, but that's just where I am right now.
No, I think that's really good advice. And just this afternoon, I learned about a new ADL resource, and I brought a few copies. It's called the Media Watch Project, and we're constantly having people call our office asking how they can help. And this is one action item that you can take. I left a few copies of this guide just right near the books, near the where you can check out. And you can also find it on our website. So this walks people through how to write a letter to the editor, how to write a letter to a university, and just how to use your voice. So we give you language and make it really easy for you to do. Your personal voice is so important. And also just to receive volumes of these messages is so very important. So I would really encourage everyone here who wants to know what can I do, pick up a pen or your keyboard and use your voice. So I see Sandy looking for questions, and while you're kind of scanning the audience to see if anyone wrote down questions for Rabbi Fersko or for me, I just want to ask you one last question. In the final chapter of your book, you provide strategies, thank you, for combating anti-Semitism. So I would love for you to talk about a couple of those strategies that you feel are the most important. And we can talk about a few now, and then also people can buy the book and learn a few more.
For me, my number one strategy, which I like the most, which you like the least, is do a Jewish thing. People want to fight anti-Semitism, and it doesn't seem direct to do a Jewish thing. But guess what? Judaism is a gift from God that's been given to us and transmitted from generation to generation to generation. We've outlasted the Babylonians, the Romans, the Inquisition, the Crusades, the Shoah. We're going to outlast Harvard, you know? We're going to outlast Cornell. The question is, what will we have to pass down? Now is the time to double down on this particular ancient sacred tradition. So my first way to fight anti-Semitism is to do a Jewish thing. Fulfill a mitzvah, light the Shabbat candles, have Shabbat dinner, and invite some friends over, because we need to know who we are. We all know what we're fighting against, but we could be much better at knowing what we're fighting for. Everything else you could see in the book.
Wonderful answer. So from some of the questions from the audience here, some people attempt to distinguish between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. So can you talk about, and I can address this as well, where anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism intersect, and where there might be some differences?
Okay, I have a whole list of questions that I think are the wrong. We're like focused on these questions, but they're not necessarily the right questions. So this is like a very, very topical question. For me, the answer is like more about the outcomes than parsing the particular lines. Do I think it's anti-Semitic to criticize the government of Israel? Like, no, I don't. But what I think is focus on the outcome, not the intent. So if the outcome of the speech, of whatever you're saying or doing or writing, is to exacerbate animosity towards Jews, whether you mean it or not, I wonder why you're saying it. If the outcome, if you're talking about Israel or about the Palestinian conflict, and yet it has no impact on Israelis or on Palestinians, but it has a negative impact on Jewish Americans, I wonder why you're saying it. So for me, it's like this is a question held in academia, but I'm dealing with real people all the time. And my question is like, are you comfortable being Jewish publicly at college, for example? And if the answer is no, then something's wrong with what they're saying.
Well, I think that's where we're seeing it the most on college campuses. And some of the rhetoric has become very, very dangerous. It's not criticizing, it's crossing the line of just criticizing the government or policies of the government, which is perfectly acceptable. But when we see things taken out on American Jews that have absolutely nothing to do with Israel's government, that is when it crosses the line into anti-Semitism.
And I'm going to make an even like harder line argument, which is as follows. I like to think like follow the bouncing ball of anti-Semitism. So what leads to those statements you're talking about? Like what's the step before those statements? And what's the step before that? And I'll just say it like this. I made a decision long ago to be what I call Israel positive, okay? It doesn't mean that I don't have critiques of Israel. I do, of course. I just decided when I'm in public, I'm going to be positive about Israel. I basically think in the U.S., we receive a barrage of critique and shame and negativity and just a hyper focus on the state of Israel. And I want to be a different kind of voice. So if there's any way that you in this room can add a little bit of Israel positivity out there, and it doesn't mean, it can be about falafel, like it can be about anything, online or in real life, I think that actually goes a long way in reversing many of these Israel negative feelings.
I agree. I've seen so many people take so much pride in sharing their ties to Israel and their personal experiences in Israel. And I think that all of us who've been there agree that it's such a special place. And so let's put that out into the world and put that out into our own communities and perhaps have those dinner table discussions about our criticisms or our questions about the government. And that's not to say that we shouldn't have those. I fully support and believe in freedom of speech, but I do agree that at this time in particular, positivity is going to go a long way. So this is, I guess, a comment, but asking us also to comment. I've called anti-Semitism the last socially acceptable prejudice to which people respond, oh no, it's not. So do you have thoughts about that? I know I've heard anti-Semitism called the oldest form of hate or the oldest form of prejudice. Do you think that it's also the last socially acceptable?
Okay, so this is a great question because I think that it gives me the opportunity to offer a definition of anti-Semitism that's helpful. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, may his memory be for a blessing, was the chief rabbi of England. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he wrote something like, anti-Semitism is not allowing the Jews to exist collectively in a way that we allow others to exist collectively. And you can take that definition and apply it to Israel, but you can also take it and apply it to your workplace, which might have, 6 affinity groups, and they say to you, the Jew, like, no, you can't have an affinity group. Like, that's sort of, to me, what the question is talking about. Yes, I do think it's sort of like an increasingly socially acceptable way of thinking, and that's very, very troubling to me. Anti-Semitism is slippery. It changes over time. It crosses every single marker we have. It crosses geography. It crosses history. It crosses cultures, religions, races, genders. anyone can really hold anti-Semitic beliefs. So it's very hard to understand, because what it does is it takes whatever the sort of worst of a culture is, whatever the greatest problem of a society is, and says the Jews are responsible for that, or the Jews are the ones, that are the worst, making this worse for you. And we're a minority, but in many contexts in the U.S., we don't seem like a minority. We don't feel like a minority even. And in some ways, like, look, we have succeeded here incredibly well, and thank God. But I do think that anti-Semitism is more popular in the U.S. than we like to admit and recognize, and that's why I wrote a book about it.
All right. So I know we didn't get to all the questions tonight. I will be here. I'd be happy to stay and talk to anyone afterward. I know Rabbi Fersko will be here signing books. I just want to end with a final question, and that is that our conversation tonight has really underscored the importance of having critical conversations about anti-Semitism, but also the effort and stamina that go into these conversations. So do you have any recommendations for really, in this difficult time, for avoiding burnout and fatigue now that anti-Semitism has taken center stage in our everyday lives?
So I'm only laughing because I'm the number one worst person to ask this question to. I am speaking every single night of this month to a different Jewish community because we are activated, right? We have, I don't know what it's like in Detroit, but I will tell you in New York, everyone's coming to synagogue, right? I got Jews, I got non-Jews coming. 2 Shabbats ago, a woman stood up in the middle of the service and said, "I'm from Sweden, and this is the best mass I've ever been to." Okay? So people are, staring at their phone all the time when they're not staring at their phone on the news. They're writing letters. They're calling their family. They're texting their loved ones in Israel. They're going to synagogue. Like, we are worked up. To me, this is so not the right thing to say in like a trendy, I'm just not a trendy person. Like, mental health takes a backseat. We have to fight for our people right now. We have to fight for ourselves, and we have to fight against anti-Semitism.
Great place to end.
Thank you very much for being here. Please purchase Rabbi Fersko's book. It's outside by the cash register. We need to talk about anti-Semitism. I wish we didn't have to talk about anti-Semitism, but thank you for being here. It was a wonderful, wonderful program. I know everybody agrees, and Emily Broder, you were an outstanding moderator, so thank you for being here with us. And Rabbi Fersko will sign your books after you purchase them out in the lobby. Thank you.